Hey folks, I'm Miss J from Miss J Teaching and Scribbles on a Page. So I wanted to try vlogging this week because it's something that I haven't really tried before, and sometimes writing those blogs and composing the actual blog format can get a little overwhelming. So I thought I would give this a try, and I would love to hear your feedback on how it goes. As you know, I've switched over from writing perspective to more of a look at children's literature, partly because that reflects the graduate courses I'm taking right now, but we will continue to talk about both, and we'll kind of see how it goes. So this week's text set I'm very excited about. We have a text on immigration. So the books that we read this week were Her Right Foot by Dave Eggers and illustrated by Sean Harris. Fantastic book, would highly recommend to have in your classroom. The other books that we read were My Two Blankets by Irena, Kobald, and Freya Blackwood. Freya Blackwood is the illustrator. She illustrates some other books. Would definitely check this person out. This is an incredible read as well. Definitely another must-have in your classroom. And then the last book we had was Wishtree by Katherine Applegate. Again, this is a book that's more geared towards older students. It's a little thicker. It's got some upper elementary level text, but it's something that's totally approachable as a read aloud, and again, something that I would highly recommend for your students. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about critical literacy and looking at illustrations in a critical literacy perspective. So both of these children's books from this week, the My Two Blankets and Her Right Foot, both had more of an illustrative way of communicating. The illustrations were equally as important as the text. So when you're teaching children to read critically, you really want to teach them to look critically at both the text and the words and what the author is trying to communicate and make the reader think, but also what the illustrations are communicating and the tone that the illustrations can create, even just with color, with how they create height and depth. Those things are very important to teach to children and to emphasize that those really impact how you see a text, how you take in the message that the author is portraying. I'm going to look at a two-page spread from Her Right Foot. This is this book by Dave Eggers. This is the two-page spread that I selected. I chose this illustration in part just because I think it's a really thought-provoking one. This is not an illustration that you would generally see in a children's book because it's got a lot more of those shadows and a little bit more of a dynamic that makes you think, huh. But there are things about this illustration that make me pause and I think are worth looking at critically. So the first thing that I notice when I look at this is that you have this giant shadow of the Statue of Liberty, and it's because she's moving. So the whole context of this book is that most people don't notice that the Statue of Liberty's right foot is tilted, so she's walking forward. She's always moving towards the immigrants that are coming to her, which is a powerful, powerful illustration, both for children and for adults. So if you're looking at this page, this is the shadow of her moving and kind of how a child would respond and how an adult would respond. You notice that the shadow is very tall. It goes across both of them. And when I was thinking about this critically, I was thinking, why did they put in a shadow instead of the statue itself? And I think, in part, because if the statue was in the image, you would have this big power and height dynamic that would kind of create more of a fear and a separation of power. But with the shadow going on, you don't have that dynamic. You know that she's got this height and this difference, but if she's not physically in the picture, I think you get less of kind of a dominating presence from the statue. The authors don't want you to be dominated or fearful of the statue. They want you to see her as something welcoming and powerful and kind of awe-inspiring, but not overpowering to a kid. You notice that the child is pointing and looking up, and especially in comparison with the adult here, the adult is staring at his cell phone, and he has yellow eyes, which makes you think of the reflection of the cell phone, and it coincides with the text right here that says, just another 150-foot woman walking off a 150-foot pedestal. Like someone who's really nonplussed by the fact that this statue is moving. And I think it's really powerful that it's an adult that's the one that really doesn't care, because I think that's a good reflection and a good thing to make us pause and think, how are we responding to the children and the world around us? These incredible moments where children notice and learn and stop, and adults tend not to because we tend to be moving too quickly in our lives. I also noticed that the child has a superhero costume and a little mask, and obviously he's pointing at the statue. He's the one that's noticing. The child's also pulling away and pointing, and the adult is continuing to walk. So it kind of makes you think of how children can be portrayed as kind of the hero of our future, how they're kind of innocent, excited. Obviously the child likes fantasy because you have this superhero element. I think it's important again to show that the child is non-threatened by the statue as related to kind of the jaded adult. I went back and forth between this adult-child thing, and I wonder if the adult was made to be kind of absorbed in their phone to make it more relatable to children who have this experience, or if the author was trying to get the child reading it to feel responsible for noticing the world around them, kind of creating this active citizenship. Sends this message to children, kind of wake up, you're the only ones noticing, which I think can be a good and a bad thing. But kind of looking at that spread, those were the things that I gleaned from it, and those were the things that when I thought critically about it and what's the author conveying and what were the choices that were made here, that's what I came up with. But I would love to hear your thoughts that you had that were different or similar as mine when you looked at that spread of this book. But again, highly recommend this. It's got a lot of history and social studies content about the statue itself. And then you also have some kind of political citizenship content that you can throw in there. You could also do immigrants. You could do an Ellis Island relation to this. You could do geography in relation to this. There's a page in here that has all the places in New York. Here's a geography page. You could do science as it talks about the copper oxidizing. There's a lot going in this book that you could connect to as far as curricular connection. And that's important to keep in mind and be thinking about as teachers is how can I throw this in my curriculum if I don't have room for it in reading? That's Her Right Foot by Dave Eggers. My Two Blankets by Irena Kobald and Freya Blackwood. This is a really, really interesting story in that it puts the immigrant as the first person protagonist, which doesn't usually happen. Usually it's the person in the native country that is welcoming them in. And this cartwheel is the first person perspective, and you don't even know the name of the other character, which I think is a really powerful statement as to who's the salient perspective that we need to be listening to in this story. And again, the illustrations in this book tell so much of the story. There's one page where you see the words are shown very much as objects and kind of as a thunderstorm going towards them. She talks about the noise being a waterfall. That I think is a really important point. The final book that was part of this text set was Wishtree by Katherine Applegate. This is a really interesting book in that it is from the perspective of a tree. So it's first person perspective of a red oak. The tree is called Red. It has all these animals living inside of it. Red is in the yard of the new immigrant family's house. This little girl, Samar, comes out every night and hangs out by the tree, and all these animals kind of bond with her, and the tree's really invested in Samar, while the community is kind of turning against her. So someone carves in the tree "leave" as a message to Samar's family, and then someone also throws the eggs at the tree, and eventually you have this whole rallying of the community around the function of the wish tree, which is based in Scottish or an Irish tradition to put wishes on a tree. It's a really, really powerful message, and I think there's a lot of really relatable emotions that happen in this. The thing that I think is really interesting about this that connects back to week 1 of this course that I'm taking with Dr. Beth Fry is that the topics that could be really, really difficult for children are discussed in fiction in a way that's approachable and safer for kids to kind of try out these perspectives and figure out how it feels. For example, there's a point in this text, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but where Red thinks they, again, another really cool lesson to throw in about gender and about pronouns. Red says that they use either he or she, and so in our class when we were discussing this book, we chose to use they because that's representative of both. So this is another cool way to introduce pronouns to your classroom. This was an incredible spread where Red is starting to think about what happens if they die and starting to really appreciate the stars. But again, this is a wise old tree's perspective. It's not like a close family member. It's not a mother or a father. So it's an approachable way to maybe talk about grief and fatality with children, or at least start bringing that up. Part of the reason that fiction and fantasy are so approachable and important for children is that they can access these hard topics and kind of practice processing through some of those emotions in a more detached way, in a safer way. And that's a really key part of reading fantasy and fiction for children. The other part of what I did this week, other than looking critically at that 2-page spread and kind of looking at these 3 books, was talking between and across these books. So what is the theme of all 3 books? I said the theme was belonging on the topic of immigration. All of the positives and negatives of immigrating to a new country, and then how do you find belonging, how do others create belonging or a lack of belonging, and how does that impact these new immigrants? Huge, very relevant issue right now. Love that this text set was assigned to us now. The characters were either a 10-year-old girl in both My Two Blankets and Wishtree, along with that red oak who is definitely not 10 years old. And then the reader of Her Right Foot is definitely geared towards a younger audience. So they're all very approachable. If this is too high of a textual level for your students to read themselves, this is a great read aloud. You also see a lot of personified characters. In Wishtree, you have the red oak, and in Her Right Foot, the Statue of Liberty is personified as a moving woman. So between Wishtree and Her Right Foot, you see that an object can represent the heart and the spirit of a community. So the wish tree and the statue both kind of represent the heart of their community and kind of the essence there, which is a cool way to look at personification and a cool way to look at how a lot of times in our lives we can see those things that represent our community and can kind of bring us together. So there's a line in Wishtree that says, being a home to others isn't always easy. Sometimes I feel like an apartment complex with too many residents who don't always get along, which I think is very salient and very related to Her Right Foot and to Ellis Island and to New York in general. You have a lot of people who are trying to find a home, and it's not always easy for them to get along. But there's another quote in Wishtree from page 23 that says, I'm not just a tree, by the way. I'm a home, a community. And that's so symbolic as far as the Statue of Liberty as well, because this is not just representing a statue, but it's representing a home and a community and an opportunity for safety and freedom. So I think that symbolism and that personification of an object that can represent a community was a big similarity between both of these. The contrast that I found between these two books were that the children in Her Right Foot, like in the 2-page spread I looked at, the children are the ones that are very aware of the statue and her movement and are very approachable. However, in Wishtree, the approachable way of writing was in making the animals that lived in the tree a very important part of the story. Again, that made it more approachable because you have this crow for comic relief, and you have all these little baby animals for comic relief, and you have all these other characters that can connect to, and they kind of dilute some of the cruelty of the story and of how cruel some of the children and community members are to Samar and her family. So that's kind of, this dilutes it with comic relief from animals that live in the tree versus this just compares a lot more of the adult and child perspective in the book. Wishtree and My Two Blankets, a compare and contrast, was how powerful welcoming and belonging can be without words. This is a really cool lesson for our little ones when you're like, I can't communicate with them, but we all know that so much of communication is nonverbal. There's a cool illustration in both of these books of how they don't need to communicate. In My Two Blankets, the blonde girl just waves to Cartwheel, and Cartwheel smiles, makes her feel so much more welcome. And in Wishtree, the crow brings Samar things that he loves and owns. And of course, we know crows collect shiny things and gives them to her, and that's how she feels welcome. So I think it's important to know not that you have to give gifts or wave and smile at everybody, but that's a really key, cool comparison between both of these books. Whereas the contrast between these two books was that the barrier to friendship in My Two Blankets is language, and that it's difficult to talk to each other, and language is such a salient part of identity. Versus in Wishtree, it was less a language barrier and more a barrier with the people that have been built up, so the stereotypes and the prejudices that existed there. Last compare contrast is My Two Blankets and Her Right Foot. Both books emphasize the role of the child in the immigrant story, and I think that's so important when we're working with children to give child perspectives and how children are kind of the root of change and have the wonder and power and perspective to change and notice the important things. These are both empowering books to give and read to children, and the power that children have in creating a welcoming place for other people. However, in My Two Blankets, the immigrant story is from the first-person perspective of Cartwheel, like I mentioned before, and Her Right Foot is an adult narrator in second person, which is unusual. You don't find that too often, and it provides a little more of the adult and statue's perspective, an educated person's perspective. So that's kind of the difference between those two. The way this text set strategy works is it's called talking between and across. It's out of the Reading Strategies book. So I've talked between and across the authors and choices of the text. So now I'll quickly talk about between and across the authors and me. So I agree with most of what's in these texts. I am someone who's very involved in social justice and has been involved in activism. I have also spent multiple summers in Palestine and in Lebanon and in Jordan, which are all countries in the Middle East. And I know the immigrant stories from those countries. Immigration and belonging and inclusion and acceptance and welcome are all very important topics to instill in our children and to kind of create as a foundation of our classroom. The only thing that I disagreed with in Wishtree was that I think it could have been just as powerful without kind of the magical elements of the story, where Simar comes to the tree at night and all the animals are really comfortable with her and come and gather around her. I don't think that was necessary. I think you could have created a connection without it, but I understand the author's choice. This book definitely, I agree, it emphasizes that personal connections for someone who's apathetic can be really important. So there's this character, Francesca. She doesn't really care about the tree or care about the impact the tree has on the community until she reads the story of her great-grandmother, I believe, and really connects with the tree in that way and how powerful it was for her great-grandmother as an immigrant. Sharing stories and history are so powerful, and friendships and community are so powerful. The only thing I differed in Her Right Foot and Me is not really a difference that I have. The last line in this book made me cry. It's incredible. It says, she must meet them in the sea. She's not content to just stand and wait. That's why she's moving, is she has to go meet them in the sea, and them being immigrants. I don't differ from this perspective. I love that perspective, to kind of almost be running towards the people that are needing help. But unfortunately, especially as we talk a lot about border control and about building walls, this perspective is different from many folks in our country. So I would definitely use this to start some conversations. But my favorite quote from this book is, liberty and freedom from oppression are not things you get or grant by standing around like some kind of statue. No, these are things that require action, courage, an unwillingness to rest. And I think, again, that was a very necessary part of the book, in that you can't just say, oh yeah, that's what the Statue of Liberty stands for, and leave it at that. There has to be some activism and action involved in order to get people from this kind of situation, in a refugee situation, into a home and into a place where they belong. And that call to action, which is so important and necessary in storytelling, is so salient and relevant. The last book was My Two Blankets and Me. I see that language creates such a huge sense of identity and security. The whole blanket concept is that her native language is her blanket that she hides under initially, and then she starts to weave a new blanket with the new language. And I think that's a really important thing for kids to understand, is how much of our identity is embedded in our language. And we don't really realize that until you're in a place where you don't have that language comfort. So I think that's something important for kids to understand and conceptualize, is not only is this a new place, but also you've lost the security of being able to communicate easily with people. The only thing I didn't like about this book was how abruptly it ended. I wish there had been kind of more of a transitional ending, but the author did come full circle in that on the last page, Cartwheel is doing a cartwheel, which I loved. And the colors get a lot brighter, so you know that it's a big shift from the beginning, where the colors are very blue and kind of more muted, to a brighter place where she feels more like she belongs and is at home. The other two things that were discussed this week really connects to My Two Blankets and immigration. It's an article called Nobody Spoke Like I Did. So there was a quote from this that says, in this era of global migration, war, and conflict with their attendant pain and suffering, each one of us is challenged as to how we respond as individuals and as global citizens. As we are literacy educators, literature plays a role in the way we inculcate positive civic and social values in our students. Again, as we are literacy educators, literature plays a role in the way we inculcate positive civic and social values in our students. It's our responsibility to create socially just students in classrooms. And we are the people that can create that link to empathy with other groups of people. So that's so important to help our students critically engage with text, so they can then critically engage with the world. I am so into the critical importance of diverse children's literature. I think it's so important that children see themselves reflected in the literature in our classrooms, not just in the literature that we have on the shelves, but in what we're teaching, the lessons that we have, the videos we show, the posters in the classroom. Everything about our classroom should reflect the children that come through there. And if we don't have a diverse group of children coming through, then we should still be reflecting those diverse people and accomplishments that our society has and that our global world has. And that I've heard over and over from my peers who are students of color or minority religions and minority gender and sexualities, that they never felt represented or seen by their teachers. And if there had been books like the ones we're discussing today, then maybe things would have been different. For books on immigration, for books on belonging and acceptance, for books on inclusive cultures, Definitely recommend these 3. Have an awesome day. Keep on teaching, keep on reading, keep on writing, and I'll see you guys next week.